Between June 1941 and February 1942, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union clashed in a titanic struggle which changed the course of history. In the battle for Russia, the German Wehrmacht, the most highly trained and successful military machine on earth, attempted to defeat the Red Army and win for Germany a vast Eastern Empire. The result was a collision of unprecedented violence. Beginning with the German invasion and culminating in the fight for Moscow, more men, tanks, guns and aircraft were committed to the inferno than had ever before been thrown into any battle. With each side led by an unscrupulous dictator and each army driven by a pitiless ideology, war was waged with a ferocity and barbarism up to then unimaginable. By the time Adolf Hitler had returned to Berlin after his triumphant campaign in France, he had already made up his mind to attack and conquer the Soviet Union. From the beginning, Hitler had built the Nazi Party on a deep hatred of communists, Jews, and Slavs, and he was convinced that Soviet communism was a Jewish conspiracy. Now he had a unique opportunity to destroy his ideological and racial enemies. At the same time, he could win for Germany the resources that would secure the Reich for generations to come. Hitler was haunted by two great fears. The first was that the Soviet Union, already embarked on a massive armaments program, would soon be so well prepared for war that the chance of a successful German attack would vanish forever. The second was the prospect of an alliance between Russia, Britain, and the United States. An alliance which Germany's slender resources could never defeat. Hitler concluded that the Reich's only hope of survival lay in the complete destruction of the Soviet Union. However, it would have to be done within a year at the very most. On July the 31st, 1940, Hitler announced to his senior military commanders that he intended to attack Russia not later than the summer of 1941. The generals protested that with Britain still hostile, Germany was exposing itself to the danger of a war on two fronts. Hitler dismissed their fears. He had seen the Red Army's dismal performance in Finland, and now he predicted, "You have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." In the planning of Barbarossa, Hitler had established clear objectives. The capture of Leningrad would secure the Baltic and connect Germany to her Finnish allies. Control of the Moscow region would ensure German dominance of the road and rail infrastructure and deprive the Red Army of its communications system. But it was in the south that the great economic prizes were to be won. The grain fields of the Ukraine would be the breadbasket of the new Reich. The mineral wealth of the Donbass and the oil fields of the Caucasus would provide the necessary resources and raw materials to wage war indefinitely. Starting at 3:15 on the morning of Sunday, June the 22nd, 1941, German guns opened up on one sector of the Soviet frontier after another. The salvos were carefully targeted. Communication centers, fuel and ammunition dumps, border defenses and barrack accommodation were all pounded without mercy. At hundreds of border posts, Soviet guards were killed without warning by specially trained assault troops who secured the bridges and crossing points.
Far behind the beleaguered Soviet frontier units, German warplanes had appeared with the dawn. The first waves concentrated their destructive power on Red Army airfields. Most Russian aircraft were caught helpless on the ground. On the first day alone, the Luftwaffe would destroy more than 1,400 Russian planes. As the hail of high explosives rained on the Soviet frontier defenses and rear areas, Russian commanders frantically tried to interpret their instructions from Moscow. They had been warned not to react to provocations, but no one had told them how to tell a provocation from a full-scale attack. In a welter of confusion, orders were given and then countermarched. Many units received no orders at all. Key communication centers were out of action, bombed, or the victims of nationalist saboteurs trained by the Germans. By 6 a.m., the whole frontier zone from East Prussia to the Carpathians was engulfed in one gigantic battle. However, it was in the center, in Belorussia, where half of all Germany's mechanized units were in action, that the most crucial battles of the opening phase were about to take place. As the German spearheads sliced through the Soviet frontier armies, Moscow failed completely to grasp the dimensions of the catastrophe which had befallen Russia. On the evening of the first day, the defense commissar, Marshal Timoshenko, had ordered all 3 Soviet fronts to mount a general counteroffensive and sweep the enemy from Soviet territory. Timoshenko's order was a fantasy. The Soviet reserve was not yet fully mobilized, and there was no operational plan. With control and communications in the frontline areas almost completely broken down, with fuel and ammunition dumps burning, and the German Air Force in control of the skies, the attacks were doomed from the start. On June the 27th, 5 days after the invasion, the armored jaws of Guderian's Panzer Group II and Hoth's Panzer Group III closed near Minsk. 200 miles into the Soviet Union and a third of the way to Moscow. It was a stunning achievement. In the vast pocket that had been created around Bialystok and Minsk, 32 Soviet infantry and 8 tank divisions were facing annihilation. While Army Group Center was smashing its way into the Soviet West Front, Army Group North had thrown its 600 tanks at the junction of the Soviet 8th and 11th Armies of the Northwest Front. On the first day of the attack, the armored spearheads crossed the Niemen and penetrated 50 miles. Near Rassenier, on the second day, 41st Panzer was counterattacked by 300 tanks of the Soviet 12th and 3rd Mechanized Corps. It took 4 days for the Germans to encircle and destroy the Russian force. Meanwhile, 56th Panzer Corps dashed for the river Dvina and, in a remarkable coup, seized bridges at Dvinsk intact. After the seizure of the Dvina bridges and the fall of Dvinsk, the leading formations of 56th Panzer Corps furiously set about enlarging the bridgehead. A priceless opportunity now offered itself. An immediate drive forwards would make it almost impossible for the Soviets to defend Leningrad. However, it was not to be. Orders, received with disbelief by the tankmen, were to wait for the infantry to arrive. In the end, the wait would last almost a week. While German operations in the north and in the center had produced dramatic advances, in the south, the invasion forces attacked a sector whose commanders had woken up quickly to the German threat, and whose tank forces vastly outnumbered the panzers. From the start, the invaders faced a determined resistance. The battle between Panzer Group 1 and the massed armor of the Soviet Southwestern Front was one of the fiercest of the whole invasion, lasting a full 4 days. The Russians fought furiously, and crews of German tanks and anti-tank guns found to their horror that the new Soviet T-34s and heavy KVs were almost immune to their weapons. However, the tanks were seldom handled well or concentrated into powerful groups. They could be isolated, and after they had been immobilized by blowing off their tracks, they could be destroyed at close quarters. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was ranging freely over the battlefield, smashing Russian armor wherever it was found. The Soviet armored pincers failed to meet at Dubno. Although Panzer Group 1 took a severe battering in the battles around Dubno, it survived the confrontation, still capable of operations. The Soviets did not. The last substantial tank forces in the south had been used up, consumed in the inferno. By the end of the first week of Operation Barbarossa, all 3 German army groups had won major battles on the frontiers and had shattered every counterattack which had been thrown at them. The German High Command was jubilant, and there was already talk of reaching Moscow within a fortnight. Hitler told his followers, to all intents and purposes, the Russians have lost the war. The euphoria would last barely a week. Events would occur on the Central Front that changed Hitler's mood from exuberance to extreme anxiety. To the astonishment of German soldiers, the encircled Russian forces in the pockets at Minsk and Bialystok were fighting on, even when their situation was plainly hopeless. Mopping up was taking far too long and costing too many German casualties. The German infantry, with no motor transport, had been slow to seal the encirclements, and many Russians were escaping the net, the very thing that Hitler had been most anxious to avoid. Although 290,000 Russian prisoners were marched westwards, and 1,500 guns and 2,500 tanks were destroyed or captured, 250,000 Russian soldiers would evade the trap or fight their way back to Soviet lines. As Hitler and his commanders realized that the victories at Bialystok and Minsk had been only partial, there were bitter recriminations. Hitler blamed the leaders of Army Group Center, particularly the panzer generals, for leaving gaps in the ring. The panzer leaders, for their part, were deeply frustrated. For almost a week, their advance east had been stopped, while they closed the pocket and waited for the infantry to catch up. They feared that if the momentum of the armored offensive was lost, Further east, Russian resistance would stiffen behind the rivers Dnieper and Dvina. On July the 3rd, Joseph Stalin made his first broadcast to the Soviet people since the start of the German invasion. Laying aside the cloak of communist ideology, he appealed for a patriotic war. There would be no surrender, and everything that could be of use to the invader was to be destroyed in his path. Behind the lines, partisan bands were to be formed, and meantime, the strategy was to defend the Soviet Union as far to the west as possible, where most of its population and its industries were based. Provision was being made to dismantle key factories which lay in the path of the invader and ship them east, along with their skilled workers. But it would all take time. Terrified that the Soviet state faced complete collapse, Stalin quickly introduced the harshest penalties for those accused of being panic-mongers, cowards, or incompetents. In the following weeks, Pavlov, the commander of West Front, was executed, along with members of his staff. As for lesser commanders, many who had broken out of encirclements were also shot for not having resisted to the end. Meanwhile, on the German side of the lines, captured Red Army soldiers thought to be communists, commissars or Jews were handed over by the army to SS Special Action Groups for immediate execution. In the months to come, many Red Army units would fight to the bitter end because their leaders dared neither surrender nor retreat. On the same day as Stalin called for a great patriotic war, the panzer leaders of Army Group Center at last got the go-ahead to resume their drive east. The main panzer forces had been static for almost a week, and now, on the very day the general offensive was resumed, the weather broke. As sudden rainstorms, typical of early July, turned the sandy tracks into streaming rivers of mud, the advancing armored divisions found themselves immobile for hours at a time. All the while, the Russian defense became more determined. Many bridges were blown, and for the first time, mines were laid to slow the German advance, an easy task with the convoys confined to the very few roads. The delays gave the Soviets time to organize for a massive armored counterblow. On July the 6th, 20th Army's 7th and 5th Mechanized Corps launched an attack with 700 tanks. The Germans had overwhelming air support, and in a 3-day battle, the 2 Soviet mechanized corps were virtually wiped out. Meanwhile, 20th Panzer Division won a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Dvina and threatened Vitebsk. To the south, away from the main crossings, Panzer Group 2 launched surprise attacks, forcing the River Dnieper. The 13th Army was pushed back, losing 5 divisions. As both German panzer groups drove east, 3 Soviet armies faced the prospect of encirclement around Smolensk. South of Smolensk, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advanced at speed, and its 29th Motorized Infantry Division took the city on July the 16th. However, to the north, Hoth's 3rd Panzer was moving much more slowly. The terrain was swampy, the rain was still a problem, and the Russians were fighting desperately to escape the trap that was developing. On July the 18th, the great armoured pincers of the two panzer groups came within 10 miles of closing. But the jaws would not finally snap shut for another 8 days. In the end, although 300,000 Russians were captured, more than 200,000 would break out to stand between the Germans and Moscow. By now, nearly 4 weeks into the campaign, it was obvious to German commanders and to Adolf Hitler himself that the number of divisions the Red Army could field had been grossly underestimated. There was no sign that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. In fact, there were worrying threats to the flanks of Army Group Center. On August the 4th, Adolf Hitler flew to Army Group Center's headquarters at Borisov, east of Minsk. By now, he had lost faith in battles of encirclement and had begun to believe that he could best defeat the Soviet Union by inflicting severe economic damage. That meant making better progress in the south to cut off Russia's oil, and in the north, the speedy capture of Leningrad. He had come to Minsk to tell the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, that his drive east towards Moscow was to be stopped, and his tanks were to be sent to Leningrad and the Ukraine. Hitler's plan involved sending the armor on 300-mile detours. The panzer generals, Guderian and Hoth, were appalled. Moscow was only 200 miles from the front, and most of the Red Army was deployed around the city. The generals were certain that only an attack there gave any chance of winning the war outright. However, Hitler was adamant, and a final desperate appeal by the army commander-in-chief, von Brauchitsch, was rejected out of hand. Hitler complained that his generals knew nothing of the economic aspects of war. The panzers were to be diverted, and that was final. By mid-July, below the Pripyat marshes, the 6th Army of Army Group South, along with Panzer Group 1, had reached to within a few miles of Kiev. The armor had then swung south, while the advance from Romania, with the Romanian 3rd Army and the German 11th and 17th, pushed east. 3 Soviet armies were squeezed into a pocket near Uman. As the pocket was eliminated, the tanks turned north and crossed the Dnieper. Meanwhile, Guderian's Panzer Group 2 had driven south and crossed the river Desna, with 2nd Army on its right. The 2 panzer groups now threatened to trap 4 Soviet armies and parts of 2 more against the great bend of the river Dnieper. For its final thrust at Leningrad, 4th Panzer Group of Army Group North had, on Hitler's orders, been reinforced by tanks from Army Group Center. On August the 8th, the panzers broke through Soviet defenses, and while 16th Army attacked to the northeast, 18th Army cleared Estonia and advanced around Lake Peipus. By the end of August, Panzer Group 4 and 18th Army had penetrated to within 30 miles of Leningrad. Meanwhile, the Finns had pushed southeast on both sides of Lake Ladoga, reaching the old Finnish-Soviet frontiers. On September the 9th, Army Group North began a final push on Leningrad. Within 2 days, German soldiers were on the heights only 7 miles from the city, and artillery was pounding the inhabitants relentlessly. Hitler's latest orders were that Leningrad should not be stormed. The advance had severed all of its road and rail links to the rest of the Soviet Union, and the city was now to be bombed, shelled, and starved into submission. The Führer had changed the priorities of the campaign yet again. Leningrad could wait. Army Group North's tanks were to be sent to the center for an all-out drive on Moscow. It was the Soviet West Front, launching furious counterattacks with its ground and air forces, which had drawn Hitler's restless attention to the Moscow sector. The problem was that Army Group Center was in no position to launch an immediate offensive. It was only 13 days since most of the group's tanks had been sent on their marathon drives to the north and south. These operations, particularly the one around Kiev, had to be finished before Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, could begin. The encirclement of Soviet forces in the south was achieved on September the 16th, when Kleist's Panzer Group 1 and Guderian's 24th Corps met at Lochwitze, 120 miles behind Kiev. For the Russians, a disaster of staggering dimensions now unfolded. The encircled Russian armies at Kiev did not give up easily. A savage battle in which the Soviets were hammered by artillery, tanks and aircraft had to be fought before the pocket was reduced. In the end, after 10 days of carnage, the Germans claimed 600,000 Red Army soldiers captured. No one knew how many had been killed in what Hitler called the greatest battle in history. After Kiev, for the first time since the invasion, the Red Army no longer outnumbered the Germans, and there were no more reserves. To defend Moscow, Stalin could field 800,000 men in 83 divisions, but no more than 25 of those divisions were fully effective, and there was a desperate shortage of armor and aircraft. On the German side, there were 2 million men in 70 divisions. Almost 1/3 of the divisions were mechanized, the highest proportion of mechanized units to infantry in any German attack of the war so far. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, began on October the 2nd. The first blow took the Soviets completely by surprise. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, returning from the Kiev battle, took Orel, a vital road junction 75 miles behind the first Russian defense line. 3 days later, the panzers pushed on Bryansk, another communication center, while 2nd Army attacked from the west. 3 Russian armies were trapped. To the north, 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies threw their pincers around Vyazma, trapping another 5 Soviet armies. Moscow's first line of defense had been shattered in the opening blows, and the door to Moscow had been burst open. It was Stalin's insistence on manning defensive lines to the very end that made the situation at Bryansk and Vyazma so catastrophic. The pockets yielded 663,000 Russian prisoners, bringing the tally since the start of the invasion to 3 million. Once again, the German High Command allowed itself to believe that the war in the East was won. This time, they were certain their belief was justified. On the Russian side, only 90,000 men and a handful of tanks were left on the last defense line in front of Moscow. In desperation, Stalin summoned General Zhukov, who had been organizing the defense of Leningrad, and gave him the job of saving the capital. Weeks before, Zhukov had resigned as chief of the general staff after a disagreement with the dictator. But now Stalin chose to forget their differences. By this time, the situation outside Moscow was critical. On October the 13th, 4th Infantry Army penetrated the last Soviet defense line at Kaluga. At the same time, to the north, 3rd Panzer penetrated to within 90 miles of the capital and looked set to break into the Soviet rear. For the Russians, serious as the situation was on the flanks, in the center there was mortal danger. There, 10th Panzer Division and the SS Das Reich Motorized Division had beaten off a furious counterattack at Borodino. They were now driving up the Smolensk to Moscow highway, advancing on Mozhaisk, the key to the central sector of the Moscow defense line, and only 60 miles from the city. With the German armies on the threshold of the capital, there was panic in Moscow. Martial law was declared. Government departments and embassies were evacuated. And there was a frantic effort to build last-ditch defenses in and around the city. Although the citizens of Moscow expected little mercy from the Germans, in fact, none knew the savage reality of Hitler's plans for the Soviet capital. The German armies had been instructed not to accept its surrender. Its inhabitants might be allowed to flee, but the city was to be obliterated from the face of the earth. In its place was to be built a gigantic reservoir. Almost from the beginning of Operation Typhoon, the weather had deteriorated steadily. The German advance, first in the south and then in the center, had gradually slowed as the season of rain and sleet had begun. Under the weight of traffic, the 3 roads on which the whole offensive depended for its supplies were reduced to quagmires. As the rain and snow persisted into a 3rd week, the supply system broke down completely. Eventually, only tracked vehicles could move at all, and their fuel consumption soared, while engines rapidly wore out. Meantime, the troops were living in appalling conditions, permanently wet, cold, and utterly exhausted. The advance slowed to as little as 2 miles a day. On October the 31st, the German Army High Command ordered a halt in Operation Typhoon. For General Zhukov, the pause was of priceless benefit. Although his forces were desperately weak, down to 190 working tanks, fresh formations were being created at great speed, and in little over a month, 11 new armies would be raised. Although some of the new formations were made up of barely trained conscripts, 30 divisions would be well-equipped and immensely tough Siberian troops. These had been freed from the eastern frontiers as Soviet intelligence assured Stalin there was no longer a threat from the Japanese. With the Siberians would come 1,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. On November the 7th, in a defiant gesture of normality, the annual Revolution Day parade was held in Moscow. The night before, the first severe frosts had hardened the ground. Only 50 miles from the city, the German armored columns were once more capable of movement. The last great effort to capture Moscow began on November the 15th. In increasingly heavy falls of snow, and with temperatures sinking ominously, the Germans threw themselves at the Soviet defenses. For their part, the Russians, on Zhukov's orders, launched a series of spoiling attacks. Little quarter was given on either side. Both attacking and defending troops knew that this could be a war-winning battle. Facing the German advance on Moscow were three Soviet fronts: Kalinin, West, and Southwest. However, it was the six mostly understrength armies of General Zhukov's West Front that would bear the main weight of the assault. The German intention was that 3rd and 4th Panzer armies would cross the Volga Canal and envelop Moscow from the northeast. 2nd Panzer Army would first take Tula, then strike behind Moscow from the southeast to close with the northern pincer. As the Russians reacted and moved to the flanks, 4th Infantry Army would smash in the center. In 2 weeks of desperate fighting, in ever more arduous and exhausting conditions, the battle in the north slowly but remorselessly crept towards the Russian capital. However, in the south, against all the odds, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was being blocked. At Tula, the Soviet 50th Army, in spite of being almost surrounded, could not be dislodged. Then came a stunning blow for the Germans. At Kashira, on November the 27th, a savage attack by well-equipped Siberian infantry, T-34s, and new Katyusha rocket launchers inflicted a severe and shocking defeat on Guderian's forces. While Guderian's attack was being blocked, then broken to the north, after 10 days of bitter and continuous fighting, 4th Panzer succeeded in crossing the Volga Canal within 20 miles of Moscow and beginning the encirclement of the capital. On December the 2nd, a forward patrol penetrated to within 15 miles of the Kremlin. On December the 2nd, the first blizzards of winter swept across the German armies facing Moscow. The war in the east was supposed to have been long since won, and the Wehrmacht had never been equipped for conditions like these. At night, the temperature would soon plummet to as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite and disease had already begun to cause as many German casualties as the endless Russian counterattacks. Dead and wounded had reached 155,000 in 3 weeks. And the strength of the infantry divisions had fallen to 50%. Meanwhile, the bitter cold caused serious problems for weapons and vehicles. Guns failed as their recoil systems froze, and engines had to be run every 4 hours, devouring fuel that was already in desperately short supply. Most disturbing of all for men who had always been able to count on protection from the air, conditions all too often grounded the Luftwaffe, while the Red Air Force seemed to grow more active as each day passed. On December the 1st, in the center, the German 4th Army had launched a final massive effort to smash what defenses remained in front of Moscow. Everything depended on the Russians having no reserves. However, for weeks, Zhukov had been denied reinforcements, as Stalin had held back increasingly powerful reserve formations. including the bulk of the Siberian divisions and their armor. The strength of the defenders was now up to over 500,000 men. On December the 5th, Zhukov launched the reserves in a massive counterattack. The Russian offensive was launched along a front 600 miles long. To the Germans, whose own offensive was being carried on with the last ounce of their strength, it came as a hideous shock. Along the entire length of the line, German armies were shattered into thousands of isolated units, fighting desperately for survival. The Battle of Moscow was lost.
At the gates of Moscow, the Wehrmacht had suffered the first serious reverse in its hitherto relentless march of conquest. Paralyzed in the grip of one of the coldest winters on record, and buffeted by incessant counterattacks, it had been gradually driven back. Yet, although shaken, the front had held. Hitler's refusal to sanction any major withdrawals had undoubtedly prevented a general rout and saved millions of marks worth of equipment, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. During the summer of 1942, the Axis forces in southern Russia resumed their offensive, attacking through the Don steppe towards the Caucasus and the Volga. Initially, the attacks made good ground. The Soviet front, weakened by a disastrously mishandled offensive in May, buckled and then broke. But as the Axis armor and infantry poured over the plains, Soviet units, falling back in disarray, regrouped and fought a number of important delaying actions: Rostov, Voronezh, and most importantly, in the great bend of the River Don. These actions, coupled with misunderstandings and indecisiveness amongst the German High Command, enabled a stand to be made on the west bank of the Volga. The place chosen was a sprawling industrial city, commanding the river traffic and the road and rail routes to the south. Stalingrad. With Barbarossa, Hitler had planned to conquer the Soviet Union in a single season's campaign. But by December 1941, the Red Army had still not been destroyed. Moscow had not fallen, and much of the industry and agriculture of the south still lay beyond his grasp. Now he faced a new and unfamiliar challenge. He had made no plans or preparations for a winter campaign, and no major offensives could be contemplated before the spring of 1942. Until then, his soldiers would have to hold the line, confronting the inevitable counterattacks, while supplies of winter clothing, ammunition, and low-temperature lubricants were hastily sent forward. When the first supply trains reached the front, they were met enthusiastically by men bowed down by acute shortages of essential supplies, by chronic immobility, and by the cold. But the respite was not to last. The German armies in Russia were at the extreme limit of their extension, far from their main supply bases and vulnerable to a quick counteroffensive. The blow fell sooner than anyone expected. On December the 6th, the Russians attacked along a 600-mile sector of the front. In the first phase, the Soviet aim was to pinch out the German salients west of Leningrad and to the north and south of Moscow. Under remorseless pressure, the Germans were gradually driven back. But there was no decisive breakthrough, and in January, buoyed by his early successes, Stalin ordered a general offensive. Initially, the attacks made good ground. Soviet pincers closed around Demyansk and Vyazma, and threatening attacks were made towards Smolensk and Bryansk. But despite these early successes, the Soviet offensive soon ran out of steam. By March, the Germans had recovered, stabilized their lines, and secured the neck of the Vyazma pocket. With the spring, both sides prepared to resume the offensive. While the German High Command decided to stabilize the front at Kharkov in advance of larger operations in the summer, the Russians, unknowingly, chose to attack through the same sector to maintain pressure in the south. On May the 12th, the Russians opened their offensive with concentric attacks on either side of Kharkov. In both sectors, the attacking forces broke through, and a serious threat to the city began to emerge. In response, the Germans accelerated the preparations for their own offensive, launching it 5 days later. Attacking northwards, German armored formations spearheaded a drive into the neck of the salient, slicing adrift the entire Soviet left wing. In the last days of May, the Kharkov pocket was systematically reduced. Of those encircled, only 22,000 managed to escape. 70,000 Russian soldiers lost their lives, and a further 200,000 were taken prisoner. Almost all of the Soviet equipment committed to the battle was either destroyed or abandoned. The battle was a disaster for the Red Army, comparable to the great defeats of the first year of the war. The whole of their southern wing had been shattered. Large sections of the line were now held by skeleton formations or by units cut off from their command and communications posts. For the Germans, the battle had been a far greater success than even they realized. Having removed the Kharkov salient, they now stood ready to mount a further strike into the south, unaware of the extent to which the forces facing them had been fundamentally weakened. Indeed, at the beginning of June, the wide expanses of the Don Steppe and the Caucasus lay virtually undefended. Although the original objectives of Barbarossa still remained valid for any future conquest of the Soviet Union, Hitler knew that his armies were too weak to achieve them all in a single year. Immediate priority had to be given to the south. Only by securing this fertile and economically rich region could he be assured of the means to continue the war. In April, he outlined his plans for the main campaign of 1942. This would be codenamed Plan Blue and would take the form of a two-pronged offensive. The overall objectives of Blue would be the destruction of the Red Army's southern front, the consolidation of the Ukraine west of the Volga, and the capture of the Caucasian oil fields. Hitler would now have some 74 divisions available for the start of Plan Blue, 54 of them German. Of these, 9 were armored and 7 motorized. 8 further divisions on their way to the front would act as a strategic reserve. In addition to this, more than half of the Luftwaffe's available strength in the east was to be committed to the battle. The left flank of the offensive would be anchored on the Volga, and the main thrust turned south towards the Caucasus. The first phase of Blue would open on the 28th of June, and in the weeks preceding the attack, supply schedules were accelerated as men and equipment were funneled into the battle zone. In all probability, this would be Hitler's last opportunity to win a decisive victory in the East. The outcome of Blue would fundamentally determine the future direction of the war. While the Germans completed their preparations for Blue, the Russians built up their defenses. The Soviet High Command knew that an attack was imminent. The only uncertainty was where and when the blow would fall. The defense of Moscow was entrusted to 3 fronts: the Northwest, Kalinin, and Western fronts. Between them, these accounted for well over half the available frontline divisions in the Soviet order of battle. South of Moscow, facing Kursk and Oryol, the Bryansk and Southwest fronts accounted for a further 20% of Russian strength. But to guard against the threat from this sector, Stalin had deployed 2 tank armies, the 3rd and the 5th, between Voronezh and the capital. West of Voronezh, 2 belts of fortifications ran south and southeast for 150 miles. In the target sector, the southern and North Caucasus fronts were perilously weak, accounting for no more than 10% of frontline divisions. Though neglecting to reinforce this sector, Stalin had ordered fortifications to be constructed around Rostov, Stalingrad, and Saratov. In reserve, there were a further 10 armies. These were stationed well behind the front and concentrated around Voronezh and Moscow. Though still in the process of formation, many of these armies would play a central role in the battle to come. During the spring and early summer of 1942, the Red Army suffered a number of catastrophes, of which Kharkov was merely the largest and most damaging. In the Crimea, it had lost a further 200,000 men, as well as vast quantities of equipment, and in the center and north, half as many again. No other nation or government could have sustained these losses, yet the Red Army and its leadership remained unbroken. This was partly due to the seemingly inexhaustible reserves of Russian manpower and to the single-minded ruthlessness of the Soviet government. But it was also a reflection on the extent to which the Soviet Union was geared up for war. In 1941, the German High Command had been shocked by the sheer size of the Red Army and by the volume of equipment captured during the first phases of the campaign. Much was obsolete, but there was ample evidence that the Russians also possessed a range of modern, highly effective weapons, and, more disturbingly, the capacity to manufacture these in quantities that Germany could never hope to match. Many of the armaments factories had been overrun, but more had been saved, stripped down, and shipped east to be rebuilt beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. Though full production would not resume until 1943, enough was reaching the front to maintain the army's defensive capability. Moreover, the experiences of the past year had forced a rationalization of the munitions industry. Obsolete weapons would be phased out, and those of proven value given priority of resources. Even in 1942, although well equipped, the Red Army was still disorganized and inefficient. Virtually nothing now remained of the 1936 officer cadre. Most of those lucky enough to survive the purges of the 1930s had been killed or captured in the first year of the war against Germany.
Major operations were now commanded by men with little or no military training, and in some cases, even less ability. Amongst senior officers, there was an almost complete lack of tactical subtlety, little regard for life, and an overwhelming reliance on the application of brute force. Throughout all levels of the army, discipline was increasingly maintained through terror and what passed for morale by crude but ceaseless propaganda. Exhortations to ever greater sacrifices made no mention of ideology, and instead appealed directly to the Russian soldier's sense of history and patriotism. This was itself a significant turning point in the war, a tacit acknowledgement of the excesses and mistakes of the past, and a grudging recognition that the Red Army's soldiers would fight harder and longer for Mother Russia than they would for socialism. In the battles to come, they would need almost superhuman endurance. In training and tactics, they were no match for their adversaries. But amid the rubble and carnage of Stalingrad, they would achieve, with only their own resources of courage and resolve, one of the most famous victories of the war. While the German armies in the Ukraine prepared to resume the offensive, those in the Crimea entered into the last phase of one of the most horrific sieges of the war. Since November of the previous year, the Soviet Black Sea port of Sevastopol had been invested by two armies, the Romanian 3rd and the German 11th. The city was a natural fortress, set amongst a tangle of rocky bluffs, ravines, and steep cliffs. In 1941, its defenses had been augmented by 3 lines of fortifications, and its garrison bolstered by reinforcements and by troops evacuated from the southern Ukraine. Early German attempts to storm the city had made little headway, and much of the winter was spent in wearing down the Soviet defenses through air and artillery bombardment. In May, the Germans completed their clearance of the eastern Crimea with the elimination of a threatening Soviet bridgehead on the Kerch Peninsula, thus enabling them to concentrate all their efforts on Sevastopol. To break through the labyrinth of defenses and reach the high ground dominating the harbor, the Germans brought up a fantastic array of heavy mortars and railway guns, amongst them some of the most awesome weapons ever built. With the capture of Sevastopol, the last pocket of resistance in the rear would be liquidated. Axis forces, numbering some 200,000 men, would be released for service elsewhere, and morale throughout the Wehrmacht would be boosted considerably. Axis forces in the Crimea continued their brutal reduction of Sevastopol, pulverizing the city through air bombardment and almost ceaseless artillery fire. In early June, German and Romanian infantry began working their way through the outer defenses towards high ground overlooking the port. On June the 20th, the Germans reached the harbour. Maintaining supplies to the garrison now became impossible. The deluge of fire continued to pour down on the city for a further 2 weeks, killing and maiming thousands of soldiers and civilians. In early July, when the Crimea was finally conquered and the remaining German and Romanian forces freed for service further east, the Soviet death toll would be impossible to calculate. Such was the scale of the carnage and confusion.
As the battle for Sevastopol drew to an end, spoiling operations were being launched against the Soviet positions east of Kharkov. The aim was to soften up the front in preparation for the launch of Blue. By the end of June, Hitler's preparations for Blue were complete. Along a line stretching from Oryol in the north to Taganrog on the Sea of Azov, he had amassed 74 divisions in 7 armies. Most of these had recently been strengthened, some considerably, in anticipation of the coming offensive. Opposing them, the Soviet forces amounted to 15 armies, grouped in 3 fronts. But these armies were normally equivalent to only 2 or 3 German divisions, and after Kharkov, many of them were in no fit state to fight. In many respects, Hitler's faith in Blue was not entirely unfounded. He possessed superior forces in the south and still retained the element of surprise. But he had now committed almost all his reserves. Far to the east, however, beyond the range of German reconnaissance, a further 10 Soviet armies were being assembled. These would be sent into battle only as the crisis developed. Early in the morning of June the 28th, massed concentrations of German artillery announced the opening of Blue. All along the northern sector of the front, the guns roared, while waves of aircraft streamed overhead, their missions carefully planned and their targets precisely defined. They struck savagely at airfields, communication centers, strategic towns, and military strongpoints. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft were ruthlessly hunted down and were soon driven from the skies completely. A sense of shock and confusion gripped the Bryansk front. In the 13th and 40th Army sectors, German infantry and tanks were slicing through the forward defenses, threatening to dislocate Golikov's left flank and shatter the junction between the Bryansk and southwest fronts. By mid-morning, it was clear that the attack was a major operation and that dangerous gaps were being torn in the front line. While 4th Panzer and its supporting infantry armies were scissoring into the Bryansk front, the second phase of Blue was unleashed against Timoshenko's southwest front. Again, German infantry and armor crashed into 21st Army, further threatening the already perilously weak junction between Timoshenko's 21st and Golikov's 40th. Soon, the whole front was in motion. In early July, 1st Panzer and 17th Army jumped off from their start lines west of the Donets. Everywhere, the Russians fell back under the weight of the onslaught. By July the 5th, forward elements of 4th Panzer had reached the Don near Voronezh and begun advancing through the western suburbs of the city. Between the Bryansk and the southwest front, there was now a gap more than 150 miles wide, through which German second echelon formations were streaming. Yet the Russians, for the first time in the war, were not fighting to hold hopelessly exposed positions, but retreating in reasonable order, as ponderous German pincers closed impotently on stragglers and rearguards. These were not the great encirclements that Hitler had hoped for, or that had characterized all previous German offensives. Yet the poverty of the catch would only serve to convince Hitler that the Red Army was on its last legs, while other, more measured assessments would indicate that, on the contrary, it was at last learning how to fight a modern war. In Voronezh, the remnants of 40th Army held out for several days, while the 5th Tank Army, hastily mobilized and rushed south,
mounted desperate attacks on the flanks of 4th Panzer's advance. Though doomed to failure, the battle for Voronezh, by embroiling 4th Panzer's spearheads in a contest for the city, gained vital time for Timoshenko, enabling the battered armies of the Southwest Front to be pulled back to the line of the Don and for the first reserve armies to be fed into the battle. In the south, the fighting for Rostov and the Don crossings was, if anything, even more intense. Aware of the disasters that had befallen Timoshenko, and fearing that his own southern front would be enveloped from the north, Malinovsky had fallen back, fighting a determined and skillful rearguard, while the core of his 5 armies escaped to the south. Angered by these delays, and believing that the Soviet center had fallen apart, Hitler now made the first of a series of fundamental alterations to the plan. 4th Panzer was detached from 6th Army, along with 6th Army's own integral armored spearhead, and sent south to assist 1st Panzer force a crossing of the lower Don. This diversion reduced 6th Army to a march and further enabled the Russians to consolidate their positions along the line of the Don and in the Don Bend. The decision was even more remarkable for the fact that the Don steppe was ideal terrain for tanks, while the lower Don and the Caucasus were anything but. By now, both sides had reorganized their forces and reordered their priorities. The overwieldy German Army Group South had been replaced by 2 smaller army groups. Army Group A consisted of both Panzer armies and the 17th Army, while Army Group B consisted of the 2nd Army, the 6th Army minus its Panzer arm, the Hungarian 2nd Army, and the Italian 8th Army. This division of force signaled a strategic change of direction. Of the 16 armored and mechanized divisions in the field, Army Group A now had 15, leaving Army Group B not only virtually bereft of mobile forces, but with a dangerously high proportion of Axis satellite divisions. Moreover, it was Army Group B that had to hold the line of the Don, seize Stalingrad on the Volga, and bear the brunt of any Soviet counteroffensive, while the 3 predominantly German armies of Army Group A struck south into the Caucasus. Facing these, there were now 4 Soviet fronts. The Bryansk front, though shorn of its left wing, held the sector east of Oryol. East of Voronezh, and holding the northern shoulder of the Don Bend, stood the Voronezh front, created by Stalin while the battle for the city was at its fiercest, and reinforced with 2 armies from the reserve. In the Bend itself, and standing directly in the path of German Army Group B, a new front was being formed. The Stalingrad front comprised 3 reserve armies along with surviving elements of Timoshenko's southwest front. The Stalingrad front was charged with the defense of the Don Bend and the approaches to the Volga. On the lower Don, and facing the full weight of Army Group A, the southern front was in the process of disengaging in preparation for a full-scale retreat. When 4th Panzer reached the Don east of Rostov, the battle for the city was entering its final stages. Barricades were everywhere. The Don bridges were wired for demolition, and Soviet rearguards manned fire points on every street corner. This, like the fighting on the Upper Don and in the Donetsk corridor,
was quite different from anything the Germans had previously encountered in their drive through Russia. This was a fighting retreat, cleverly organized and conducted with skill and determination. The defense of Rostov, which eventually fell on July the 23rd, enabled corps formations of the Southern Front to escape to the south and east. With the Don crossings secured and the eastward march of 6th Army now flagging in the stifling heat of high summer, Hitler again altered his dispositions, detaching 2 armored and 3 mechanized divisions from 4th Panzer to assist Paulus in the Don Bend, and then ordering the infantry rump of 4th Panzer with its single remaining armored division to turn northeast and attack across the Don steppe towards the Volga. While the panzers raced backwards and forwards across the steppe, and the German infantry marched and fought over the drab plains of southern Russia, the Soviet forces in the Don Bend were reinforcing and preparing their defenses. Unknown to Hitler, Stalin had ordered no further retreat in the east. The Red Army was to stand and fight. If it fell back from the Don, it would not fall back beyond the Volga. In late July, 6th Army resumed its offensive in the Don Bend. Armored spearheads were driven into the flanks of the Soviet front, while the infantry maintained steady pressure in the center. In the northern sector, the attacks made good progress. Armored and mechanized forces broke through the Russian defenses and began cutting their way southeast towards Kalach. On the lower Don, 6th Army's southern pincer smashed into the junction of the 62nd and 64th Armies. The fighting in the Don Bend persisted through the first 3 weeks of August. While 6th Army hacked its way east, 4th Panzer advanced steadily northwards, rolling back the front into the isthmus between the Don and the Volga. By August the 10th, Paulus had largely completed the clearance of the Don Bend directly west of Stalingrad. But in the northern sector, the Russians still held a number of important positions on the west bank. These proved almost impossible to pinch out and served to further delay Paulus's advance east. For Hitler, the drive to the Volga was taking far longer than he had originally anticipated and was becoming a cause for serious concern amongst the German High Command. In contrast, the progress of German Army Group A was startling. After jumping off from its bridgeheads on the lower Don on July the 25th, it had fanned out on a broad front. While the 17th Army swung west towards the Black Sea, the 1st Panzer Army attacked to the south and east, sweeping through country largely abandoned by the Russians. On August the 9th, forward units of 1st Panzer reached the northern foothills of the Caucasus, a distance of more than 300 miles. In the Don Bend, however, there was furious activity. While the fighting in the north continued, German assault troops prepared to storm the river at its closest conjunction with the Volga. The operation, originally scheduled for August the 19th, was postponed for a further 2 days and finally launched on August the 21st, along a frontage of some 20 miles. By the morning of the following day, 22 pontoon bridges had been thrown over the Don, and German infantry and armor was once again rolling east. The drive to the Volga was spearheaded by the 16th Panzer Division, supported by 2 divisions of motorized infantry. These attacked in echelon out of the Don bridgehead on August the 23rd. driving at full speed over the remaining 36 miles of steppe. This was the kind of warfare in which the Wehrmacht excelled. Strongpoints were bypassed or dealt with by mobile assault groups peeling off from the main thrust. Had these tactics been employed in mid-July, Stalingrad could have been taken off the march. In late August, when the strategic aims of Blue had become transparently clear and the Soviet High Command had recovered from its initial shock, they carried a serious element of risk. While Paulus's armored spearhead hurtled east over the broad, flat plains, the full weight of the 4th Air Fleet was unleashed on Stalingrad. Massed formations of German bombers laid down a carpet of destruction. Firestorms raged through the timber-built suburbs, killing 40,000 people in one day. The docks, the administrative center, and large tracts of the industrial heart of the city were laid waste. Huge palls of smoke hung in the sky, visible for miles. Later that day, forward units of 16th Panzer reached the Volga north of Stalingrad. In its drive to the Volga, 16th Panzer had sliced away the southeast front from the Stalingrad front. But in so doing, it had become dangerously exposed. In its wake, the motorized infantry formations had encountered stiffening resistance and had failed to keep pace with the armor. With its back to the Volga and with stocks of fuel and ammunition running low, 16th Panzer was now isolated. While the supporting infantry fought its way forward, 16th Panzer was rocked by furious Soviet counteroffensives, unrolling from the north and south. For 6 days, it held fast to its positions on the Volga, ranging its guns on the river traffic and mounting sporadic attacks through the sprawling northern suburbs of Stalingrad. Overhead, the Luftwaffe continued its campaign of slaughter and destruction. Thousands of sorties were flown over the stricken city. The anti-aircraft defenses were overwhelmed, and Soviet fighters swept from the sky. With remorseless logic, Stalingrad on the Volga, once a famous citadel of the Tsars and the gateway to Asia, was being slowly pounded into rubble. Towards the end of August, the Soviet armies of the Southeast Front were being pressed relentlessly from the south and west. Between the Don and the Volga, a huge salient was formed by the northerly thrust of the 4th Panzer Army and the continuing pressure of 6th Army's infantry. The Soviet left flank was held by the 57th and 51st Armies and was safely anchored along a line of saltwater lakes. But the 62nd, and to an even greater extent the 64th, held dangerously exposed positions in the salient. On August the 29th, 4th Panzer mounted a major offensive through the center of the salient towards Stalingrad. The attack sliced into the rear of the 64th Army, threatening it and part of the 62nd with encirclement. 6th Army was ordered to detach mobile forces from the Volga corridor and strike quickly south to join up with 4th Panzer's spearhead. But the corridor was only just holding and subject to increasingly frantic attacks by the 4th Tank Army. The pressure in the north tied up 6th Army's mobile formations for 3 vital days, enabling the Soviet forces in the salient to conduct a fighting retreat, escaping eastwards to inner defense lines west of the Volga. Once again, the Germans had failed to achieve a major encirclement, further prolonging the campaign and ensuring that the fight for the city would be long and hard. At the end of August, General Zhukov assumed overall command of the Soviet forces in the south. Zhukov's task was to coordinate the various front commands, organize the defense of Stalingrad, and maintain pressure on 6th Army's vulnerable left flank. In early September, while the German ring closed around the city, Zhukov mounted a series of offensives from the north. Though failing to break through the German cordon, the attacks helped to hinder 6th Army's advance by diverting attention and forces from the center to the periphery. Meanwhile, Soviet reserves continued to flow south, some to reinforce the 62nd Army in Stalingrad, but many more to bolster the flanks and to provide Zhukov with the necessary strength and flexibility to mount local counterattacks. In mid-September, Soviet pressure in the north eased off enough to allow Paulus to resume his efforts in Stalingrad. The city was now surrounded on 3 sides, and the Volga crossings were under fire from German artillery. On the 13th, the Germans attacked through the southern suburbs, edging forward under cover of airstrikes and supported by tanks and artillery. The objective was the main landing stage, handling ferry traffic from the east bank. Initially, the attacks made good ground, but as the Germans advanced, Soviet resistance began to intensify. Amid the ruins of the city center, they soon became bogged down in vicious street fighting. General Chuikov, commanding 62nd Army, reorganized and rallied the defenders, creating a series of mini-fortresses and funneling the Germans into killing zones. These were carefully mapped out, ringed with anti-tank weapons, and precisely targeted by artillery batteries situated on the far shore. Gradually, the Germans fought their way forward, pressing in now from the north as well as the south. Some isolated strongpoints held out for days, others changed hands several times. Often the front line was no more than an interior wall or the floor space separating different levels in the same building. Gains were measured in yards, weighed against the cost in casualties, and held on to desperately in the face of almost suicidal Soviet counterattacks. Overhead, clouds of bombers continued to pulverize what remained of the Soviet rear. Hardly a single building now remained intact. The landing areas were clogged with corpses, and the river channels with the hulks of burning ferries. Yet somehow or other, in small groups, Soviet reinforcements continued to get through. Those that reached the front were already veterans, survivors of the grim and perilous journey across the Volga. Stalingrad had become a place of horror, a vortex of fire and noise. Small arms clattered incessantly, punctuated only by the rumble of artillery, the whine and thud of ordnance, and the deafening crash of bombs. The fighting grew more intense, more personal, and more savage. Even the drains and sewers became the setting for small, murderous clashes between heavily armed infiltration groups. In a series of such brutal encounters, headlong assaults and slow, grinding offensives, the Germans gradually fought their way through the city center towards the Volga. At the end of September, the Germans switched the main focus of their offensive from the southern and central sectors of Stalingrad to the factory district in the north. 3 great complexes dominated the skyline: the Red October, barricades, and tractor factories. These massive concrete fortresses reared up out of a sea of rubble, many of their workshops still turning out tanks, guns, and ammunition for the front. With the main landing stage and most of the city centre now in German hands, these strongholds comprised the last major pocket of Soviet resistance. On October the 3rd, the Germans attacked with 5 divisions along a 3-mile front. Tanks crunched over mountains of debris, firing at point-blank range into rubble-filled streets. Behind them, the infantry advanced cautiously, visibly wary of the dangers that lurked unseen among the shadows in the broken buildings. As it had in the south, the German offensive in the north soon began to flag. The Russians contested every foot of ground, every floor and workshop. Factory workers and soldiers fought side by side. No quarter was given, and no prisoners taken. But for the Russians, now fighting with their backs to the Volga, there was not even the possibility of retreat. Fresh reserves were brought up by both sides, and the fighting flared and raged among the craters and ruins. On October the 14th, in an attempt to maintain the momentum of the attack, Paulus committed what remained of his reserves, driving to within a few hundred yards of the Volga. The Germans now controlled 90% of the city, but the Russians still held a tenuous bridgehead, for which it seemed they were quite prepared to sacrifice their lives. Paulus's troops were by now exhausted, but this was the least of his concerns. To achieve even this incomplete victory, he had in the preceding weeks stripped his flanks of all the combat forces they could conceivably shed. He had lied to Hitler, grossly exaggerating the size of the force he faced in Stalingrad. And now reports were coming in of major Soviet troop concentrations on the flanks. Added to this, the first frosts of winter had arrived earlier than expected. Cold winds blew in from the east, and flecks of snow had begun to pepper the rubble, the charred timbers, and the grey uniforms of his men. Far to the south, the advance of German Army Group A had likewise ground to a halt, achieving little of its early promise. When Kleist's 1st Panzer Army reached Maikop, the oil fields were ablaze, the scale of destruction so extensive that a year's work would be required to bring them back into operation. The remaining oil-producing areas lay south of the Caucasus, a 700-mile-long chain of untamed mountains, stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, and crowned by the 18,000-foot-high peak of Mount Elbrus. There were few passes, and those that existed were high, tortuous, and easy to defend. Throughout August and September, German mountain troops had probed for a way through. But in October, when the onset of winter made further attempts futile, they were still no nearer to their objectives. While 62nd Army drew the Germans ever deeper into the cauldron of Stalingrad, Zhukov was secretly assembling forces in preparation for his own offensive. Initially, the plan had been drawn up in response to Stalin's incessant demands for diversionary attacks against Sixth Army's flanks. But as the battle for the city intensified and these flanks became increasingly strained, the plan grew steadily in scope and ambition. In preparation for the launch of the offensive, the Soviet fronts were once again reorganized. In place of the old Stalingrad front, two new fronts were created, the Southwest and Don fronts, while the Southeast front was now renamed as the Stalingrad front. The offensive was scheduled to be launched in two stages. In stage one, the Soviet armies of the Southwest front would attack out of the Don bridgeheads, striking south and east through the Don Bend towards the town of Kalach. In stage two, timed for the following day, heavily reinforced formations deployed on the left wing of the Stalingrad front would attack westwards towards the Don, with the overall aim of encircling the mass of the German forces investing Stalingrad. While the Soviet pincers sliced through the German rear, the armies of the Don front, and even those on the tattered right wing of the Stalingrad front, would maintain pressure in the center. Though ambitious, the plan was basically sound, capitalizing on the growing overextension of Axis forces in the Stalingrad sector. Most of the German 6th Army and all of the 4th Panzer Army were now concentrated between the Don and the Volga, leaving the flanks weakly held by 4 unreliable and under-strength Axis satellite armies. Of these, it was upon the Romanian 3rd and 4th armies that the main weight of the Soviet offensive would fall. Throughout October and early November, while the Russians completed their build-up on the ground, the Red Air Force was gradually winning the battle for mastery in the air. At first, Soviet air operations in the Stalingrad sector had been confined to the hours of darkness or to localized raids. But as more and better aircraft became available, the raiding strategy was discarded in favor of one of all-out offense. Aerial dominance in key sectors of the battle zone was essential to ensure success on the ground. More than 1 million Russian soldiers would be thrown against the Axis lines, and the final deployments would be difficult to disguise. German reconnaissance efforts had to be frustrated, and as the attack got underway, Soviet breakthrough forces would need to be given adequate fighter cover and tactical air support. At dawn on November the 19th, the Soviet offensive opened with concentrated artillery attacks on the Romanian positions opposite the Southwest front. The barrage was devastating. In the preceding days, thousands of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers had been secretly assembled in narrow breakthrough sectors. In a crescendo of fire, the Romanian lines were torn apart, trenches obliterated, and bunkers and pillboxes demolished. By midday, the Romanian Third Army had been pushed aside, and Soviet tanks and infantry were swarming over the plains. On the following day, the second stage of the offensive was launched against the Romanian Fourth Army in the Don-Volga Isthmus. Once again, the great swirling mass of Soviet armor and infantry overwhelmed the defense. Army Group B was in chaos. In all sectors, the pressure was intense. Attacks were launched against 6th Army's positions in the Don Bend, against 4th Panzer to the south of Stalingrad, and out of the Stalingrad bridgehead itself. Assailed on all sides and harassed from the air, the German forces in the Stalingrad sector were unable to react in time to stem the flood. 3 days later, after a blistering drive through the Don Bend, Soviet forces of the Southwest Front linked up with those of the Stalingrad Front, thus completing the encirclement of the mighty German 6th Army and most of the 4th Panzer Army. While the Russians feverishly reinforced the ring, the fighting continued in Stalingrad. Buoyed by reports of the catastrophe that had overtaken 6th Army, Zhuikov's 62nd Army fought with renewed confidence and vigor. At last there was hope, not merely of relief, but of a heroic and crushing victory against all the odds. On 3 occasions, while the opportunity still existed, Paulus requested permission to mount a breakout to the southwest. On each occasion, his request was denied. Hitler would countenance no withdrawal from the Volga. Stalingrad was to be turned into a fortress, and until 6th Army could be relieved, it would be supplied by airlift. From the outset, the air supply of 6th Army fell far short of even the most minimal requirements. Of the 500 tons a day promised to Paulus, less than 100 were actually getting through. Stocks of food, ammunition and fuel gradually dwindled, rendering 6th Army increasingly immobile and defenseless. Unless the situation improved, the 300,000 German and Romanian troops trapped in the pocket would be slowly starved into submission. At the end of November, Hitler created Army Group Don to hold the line between Army Groups A and B. Army Group Don was commanded by General Erich von Manstein and consisted of the 6th Army in the Stalingrad pocket, which now included the encircled elements of the 4th Panzer Army, the remnants of the 4th Romanian Army, and a reconstituted 4th Panzer Army, cobbled together from support units and bolstered by 4 weak panzer divisions. Manstein's plan was to attack through the Don-Volga Isthmus, where the Russian infantry was most exposed, enabling 6th Army to break out to the southwest. The plan had 2 flaws. The first was Hitler's opposition to any withdrawal from the Volga. The second was that, unbeknown to Manstein, the Soviets were preparing their own offensive. This would be mounted by the Voronezh and Southwest fronts and would be launched against the Italian 8th Army on the right flank of Army Group B, with the aim of cutting off all the German forces south of the Don. The Don and Stalingrad fronts would meanwhile maintain the pressure on 6th Army in the Stalingrad pocket and repel any attempt at relief. Despite careful planning and tactical support from the Luftwaffe, Manstein's relief offensive had little real prospect of success. With only 2 armored divisions committed to the attack, there was no possibility of forcing a permanent corridor across the 60 miles of snow-covered steppe to Stalingrad. At best, Manstein's forces could press only part of the way, harass and disorganize the Soviet forces in the ring, and provide one last opportunity for 6th Army to break out. Inevitably, on December the 19th, after a week of heavy fighting, the relief offensive was finally brought to a halt along the line of the Mishkova River, barely halfway to Stalingrad. For a further 5 days,
the Germans held these forward positions in the forlorn hope that Paulus would defy Hitler's express command and order 6th Army to attempt a breakout. For Army Group Don, the situation was growing more perilous by the day. On December the 16th, the Russians had sliced through the Italian 8th Army, decimating 5 of its divisions and throwing the rest into panic. There was now a gap, some 90 miles wide, between Army Groups B and Don. On Christmas Eve, the relief forces in the Don-Volga Isthmus began withdrawing from their forward positions on the Mishkova River. Simultaneously, Army Group A was secretly preparing to abandon the Caucasus. The fate of 6th Army was now inescapable. Throughout January of 1943, the Russians tightened the noose around 6th Army, while simultaneously thrusting ever westwards across the Don and the Donets towards Rostov. On January the 12th, the storm broke over the Hungarian 2nd Army on the Upper Don. The destruction of the Axis satellite armies in Russia was now complete. While Soviet armor rolled through the Donets corridor towards Kharkov, the Germans rushed frantically to seal the gaps and stabilize the line. Everything won over the course of Blau was being rapidly abandoned. Only 6th Army remained in position, but utterly surrounded and increasingly isolated in the ruins of Stalingrad. The final phase of the Russian assault on 6th Army began on January the 22nd. By now, the Stalingrad pocket had been reduced to a third of its original size, and 6th Army was separated from Army Group Don by 160 miles of steppe. That day, the Russians overran the last serviceable airfield available to Paulus. For 10 more days, the survivors of 6th Army fought on to the limits of their strength and endurance. Soviet attacks unrolled from every direction. On January the 25th, Russian troops advancing from the west linked up with units of the 62nd Army in the Volga bridgehead. 6th Army was now cut in half and reduced to fighting for a few square miles of frozen rubble. On January the 31st, the Battle of Stalingrad ended for General Paulus, only that day promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler. He had, as he had been ordered, held out until the last possible moment, surrendering only when the Russians reached the door of his headquarters. The capitulation of Paulus brought the fighting in the southern enclave to an end, but in the northern enclave, the killing went on for a further 2 days. The last pockets of resistance in the north were not liquidated until February the 2nd, and only then at the cost of several thousand more lives. Those emerging from the ruins of the factory district had fought on without hope until their ammunition and their strength were spent. They were exhausted and close to starvation, and many suffered from untreated wounds or frostbite. But they had few illusions about what lay in store for them. In Stalingrad, the war had plumbed new depths of squalor. Men had been fed into the carnage with little apparent regard for their lives. Many had become brutalized and indifferent to the sufferings of others. On both sides, the killing of prisoners was now common practice, and for the survivors of 6th Army, the ordeal had not yet ended.
Of the 110,000 German soldiers taken prisoner by the Russians, among them 24 generals, only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. 20 German divisions were wiped from the order of battle, and many more gravely weakened. 6th Army was destroyed utterly, and with it, 6 months' production of the war factories of the Reich. In addition, the armies of Italy, Hungary, and Romania had either been demolished or driven in rout from the battlefield, and all the lands east and south of the Don had been abandoned to the Russians. West of the Don, the German withdrawal continued through the first months of 1943. Army Group A was extricated from the Caucasus, and Army Group B was pulled back over the Donets. Kharkov was abandoned, and then recaptured in a brilliantly executed counteroffensive. But this was to be the Wehrmacht's last significant victory in the East. Its losses over the course of Blau had been crippling and could never be adequately replaced. In the spring of 1943, when the dust finally settled over the Don steppe and over the fire-blackened ruins of Stalingrad, Hitler's war of conquest had become a battle for survival. In Stalingrad, he had tried to break the Red Army at the furthest limit of its retreat. Instead, he had all but broken the Wehrmacht. The battle also marked the beginning of the march west, the reconquest of Russia, and the drive through Eastern Europe to the gates of Berlin. It was in July 1943 that the Russian city of Kursk bore witness to the largest tank battle in history. The outcome of the battle was crucial. At Kursk, the Soviet army would draw the German forces into a deliberate battle of attrition, designed to grind down Hitler's last remaining attacking strength in the east. Hitler's generals had advised him to adopt a defensive posture on the Eastern Front during 1943. The last 2 years had cost them dearly, and they needed a chance to rest and regroup. But Hitler was adamant. He would attack. By mid-1943, the focus of attention would once more be in the south of Russia, where the Germans were to make one more attempt to gain the decisive edge. The plan was to advance from the north and south towards Kursk and trap the Soviets in a huge pocket. This pocket could then be systematically destroyed. To make the plan work, however, the attack would have to be launched quickly before the Russians had time to prepare defenses. The initial plan had May as the start date, but various delays forced the start date back to July, by which time the Russians had prepared defensive positions that would present the Germans with formidable obstacles. In all, the Russians prepared a total of 5 main defensive lines. The first 2 lines ran around the perimeter of the pocket to a depth of around 10 to 12 miles and were situated close to each other. The remaining lines were spaced apart and ran to a depth of over 150 miles in total. Zhukov was clearly taking no chances. Within these defensive lines, construction began on individual positions that were to blunt the expected strong German armored attacks. Hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were sent to the area. Cheap, easy to manufacture, but highly effective, these devices were planted in huge quantities. Estimates suggest a figure of up to 5,000 mines per mile of front. Other tried and tested measures, such as anti-tank ditches and barbed wire, were also widely employed. The intention was to draw in, hold up, and then destroy the attacker. The
The aerial phase of the coming battle was to assume an importance almost equal to the fighting on land. The number of aircraft that did battle was vast, with around 2,000 planes on the German side, lined up against almost 3,000 on the Russian. The Russian Air Force had improved steadily since the 1941 German invasion, and they were, by this stage of the war, a well-equipped and well-organized force. They had also managed to gain a vital numerical superiority over the Luftwaffe. Zhukov poured huge amounts of men and materials into the area, and great emphasis was placed on the use of artillery. No fewer than 20,000 artillery pieces would be used during this coming battle. Like mines, artillery pieces were easier and cheaper to manufacture than tanks. The numbers of Russian soldiers sent into the Kursk salient area exceeded 1.3 million. Some 900,000 German soldiers were committed to the Battle of Kursk. Not only were they outnumbered from the outset, they also bore the burden of having to take the offensive. The reliable information provided to the Soviet sources revealed the date and the time of the German attack, which was further confirmed by captured German prisoners. Zhukov therefore planned a huge preemptive artillery strike against the German positions. The aim was to catch the Germans as they began to assemble, and thus deliver a severe psychological blow to the enemy, even before a shot had been fired. In the central front area, the Russian artillery opened up, and for almost an hour, hundreds of guns fired towards the suspected enemy emplacements. In the north, Model's forces quickly recovered from the Russian barrage and began to reply with their own artillery attack. And over the northern part of the Kursk salient, the noises, flashes of light, death and destruction reached a ferocious intensity. As this duel between the two sides continued, elements of Luftflotte 6 arrived to begin ferocious attacks on suspected Russian positions. Amid the thunder of exploding shells, the German infantry and panzers moved out against the enemy lines. Almost immediately, Model's troops ran into the well-prepared Russian killing zones. Model was fast discovering that the Russian forces presented a virtual brick wall in the path of his advance. He urged his troops forward to try and discover a weak point in the Russian lines. The enemy defences near Ponry on the left flank were too strong for the Germans to achieve a breakthrough, and Model had to push on in any direction possible. Russian reserves had been moved towards this area during the night of the 5th of July, and they began to commit themselves to the battle on the 6th. As daylight broke over this northern area, both sides locked together in a bitter struggle to gain their separate objectives. The Tiger tanks of the 505th Schwere Abteilung were fully committed to the battle by the anxious Germans. They slammed into the Soviet defences and the increasing number of Soviet forces moving into the area, but made limited headway as the defensive measures employed by Rossikovsky had been well planned. They had to cope with the infantry's T-34s, anti-tank guns, and anti-tank rifles. Slowly, the Tiger tank losses mounted, reducing their effectiveness and, more importantly, their influence on the battle. Russian aircraft had also begun to make their presence felt by attacking German targets. German and Russian pilots dueled for control of the skies over the northern sector. The Soviet defensive wall in the northern part of the salient slowed Model's advance to a mere crawl. These delays kept his forces contained within a relatively small area. It was now apparent that the forces available to Model were insufficient to smash through the Russian lines. Ferocious battles raged over the area as both sides sought an advantage, but none was gained. The area descended into stalemate over the next few days. The total distance covered by Model's 9th Army in the northern sector of the Kursk salient during Citadel was around 12 miles. The capture of Kursk, if achieved, would not be sufficient to defeat the Russian forces in this area. Model's forces were contained in an area that was around 40 miles short of their target. If Kursk were to fall to Hoth's men, a gap of this size would allow the Russians to pour reinforcements into the salient at their will. Powerless to influence the battle any further, Model contented himself with holding on to the areas already captured. The German forces in the north had been stalled. But the real focus of this most historic of battles was in the south. In the southern sector, Hoth's 4th Army enjoyed the largest concentration of tanks under the control of the best divisions in the German order of battle. Hoth decided to jump ahead of the planned start date of the attack. Aircraft from Luftflotte 4 began the attack on the enemy-held positions, followed by a German artillery barrage. As this barrage lifted, the infantry and tanks moved forward to engage the enemy, and throughout the day, the front line was pushed back in favor of the Germans. The fighting was heavy, and in some areas, the objectives given were not taken until the hours of darkness. This was the first in a series of setbacks for the Russians in the south. These setbacks accumulated steadily over the next few days. The 5th of July began with the 4th Panzer Army in control of the vital high ground. The German artillery in the southern region was therefore able to deliver its attack first. As this was happening, the Russian Air Force was on its way to attack the German airfields. But the Germans detected their approach and quickly sent their own planes to intercept. An intensive air battle ensued over the southern part of the salient as the German fighters tore into the Russian formations. At the end of the engagement, the Luftwaffe of Luftflotte 4 was in control of the air. Against this backdrop, the panzers moved forward. The removal of the aerial threat and the fact that the Russian ground units were expecting a different focus of attack allowed the German tanks to smash through the defensive positions. The Russians realized that they were wrong in their estimates of the disposition of the enemy armored foundations, and that they were about to bear the brunt of the strong enemy forces lined up in front of them. The Germans were using a new tactic based on the new heavy tanks, which was known as a Panzer Kiel, or armored wedge. This tactic placed the heavier Tigers at the tip of the wedge, with the Panthers forming the outer edges. The weaker Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs were placed in the center of the wedge. The Russians were not prepared for the rate of the German advances. Their defensive positions did inflict losses on the Germans, and they held fast in many areas. By the end of the first day, some of the 4th Panzer Army had advanced up to 15 miles. This was more than Model's forces managed in 8 days. It could have been much further, but late changes of orders meant that insufficient time had been left for mine clearance. An enraged General Guderian watched as many of his priceless German Tigers were needlessly destroyed by mines. By the end of the 3rd day's fighting, the Germans had made an advance of around 20 miles. This was beginning to cause concern for the Russians. So much that they ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army and other reserves to be moved from the steppe front and into the area of Prokhorovka. The ferociousness of the preceding day's fighting was about to be dwarfed in scale and intensity. The two armies were now on a direct collision course. The Russians knew of the armor-led force bearing down on them and were ready to meet and destroy the threat. The Germans, however, were not aware of the strong enemy concentration of tanks that was facing them. The Russians had managed to place around 850 of their tanks in the surrounding area. The Germans had around 300 usable tanks advancing directly in the battle zone, with a further 230 fighting to their left. Hoth felt that he had inflicted serious losses on the Russians and was expecting a quick victory that would open the way for a rapid advance. The dawn of the 12th of July would see an unprecedented clash of tanks that would decide the outcome of the whole campaign. Neither side would have foreseen or planned what occurred next. The two tank advances smashed into each other, head-on. From this point onwards, all control of the battle disappeared, and total confusion set in. The planes and artillery that would have usually joined in the battle were rendered impotent, as the close proximity of the machines and the swirling dust clouds made it impossible to tell friend or foe apart. Rather than risk destroying their own machines, the air forces of both sides were left with no option other than to let the tanks get on with the battle. The German Tigers and Panthers could not make effective use of their long-range guns, and to their horror, they discovered that the Russian tanks were able to penetrate their armor at this short range. Another tactic employed by the numerically superior Russians was to drive straight into the German tanks and ram them, completely destroying both machines and their occupants. The Soviets knew that their tanks could always be replaced, but for the Germans, at the limit of their capability, each Tiger lost was lost forever. The 12-hour battle had drawn in and chewed up the best divisions that Hitler possessed. Tanks and men had been lost at a steady rate since the start of the offensive, and by the time they reached Prokhorovka, they were in no fit state to sustain a heavy attack. The Germans had maintained fairly constant numbers of tanks in the field through the skill of the tank repair shops. But the size of the enemy forces facing them and their lack of a reserve prevented any further advances. The Russians had lost over 400 tanks in the battle thus far and were themselves left in a vulnerable position by the end of the day. They expected the Germans to begin the following day with a sizable attack. During the night of July the 12th, the Russians and Germans recovered what vehicles they could from the battlefield and readied them for use again. The 13th, however, would not see the Germans resume their attempts to advance.
it would actually see a direct Führer order calling off the Citadel offensive. The rotten edifice that Hitler spoke of in his planning of Barbarossa was a fantasy. The reality was a strong and determined country that would swallow millions of his troops in the titanic battles that raged from June 1941 to May 1945. Battles that ended at the very doors of Hitler's bunker in Berlin.
The battle for Russia had cost the German army 250,000 dead, 500,000 wounded, and most of its tanks. Hitler fired 2 field marshals and 35 generals, but nothing could change the fate to which Germany was now condemned. No new sources of oil or strategic materials had been won, and the Wehrmacht was embroiled in conflicts on 2 fronts. Worst of all, America had entered the war the previous December. Hitler now had to face the very thing he had been desperate to avoid from the start: Russia, Britain, and the United States in an alliance Germany could never hope to defeat.